Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Tonight, we enter into the upper room with Jesus and his disciples and reflect on foot washing and the Last Supper before they go out together to Gethsemane. Tonight's story is one of the most memorable that we have of Jesus and his disciples because every time we gather for communion, we're invited to remember the warmth and intensity of what Jesus shares with them in his words and actions. I find it helpful to reflect on the transitions that happen in the course of Holy Week, from Palm Sunday to the events of tonight and Good Friday and Easter. One of those transitions involves the number of people gathered around Jesus in support of him and how that progresses. On Palm Sunday, masses of people followed him into Jerusalem, celebrating who they hoped would be their new king. We can imagine what that excitement felt like and the hope it represented. Tonight, we move to this small and very personal gathering of Jesus and his disciples. Only those closest surround him. I want to share a couple of works of art. This first is called The Last Supper by a Dutch artist, Philip Koninck, from the late 1650s. I just appreciate the simple, subdued use of color and its use of light. I find myself just drawn into the scene and with a sense for the atmosphere of the upper room in that moment. When you look closely, the warmth at the center is also accompanied by something more serious. There's also some kind of distress around the table. In Koninck's work, you can see a group of the disciples huddled off to the left. They're wondering perhaps about what is to come. The image may be portraying the moments after Jesus announces that one of them is not clean, foreshadowing his betrayal. After Jesus washes his disciples' feet and shares supper with them, on this night he goes with them to an olive grove called Gethsemane, which is named after the olive press there. As it grows late, he takes three of his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, away with him and asks them to stay awake and pray with him, but they fall asleep and he is alone. This is the work by Robert Walter Weir, an American from the 1800s who tried to depict that moment of lonely time, struggling with what is to come. You can see him weighed down on his own in the center with the suggestion of some of his disciples nearby to the right. By the end of tonight, Jesus is arrested, the disciples flee, and Jesus and each of his disciples are very isolated, setting the stage for Friday and his own isolation on the cross. As we transition from crowd to small group to isolation, the emotions follow, from joy and hope on Palm Sunday to more serious and thoughtful in the upper room, to worry and fear. Good Friday is grief-stricken as the reality of what is happening sets in. The disciples are all scattered and separated, Peter watching Jesus from a distance. Others have fled to escape arrest. But tonight is a time to reflect and gather around the table in relationship to God and one another. In this supper that Jesus shares, it is a portion of the Passover meal, which we heard referenced in the first reading. And in that meal, The lamb that is slaughtered, Jesus comes to take on its symbolic identity. No more is there any talk of the kind of threats and danger and death that accompanied that first Passover, but instead, Jesus will take on the suffering of the world to free us for life. What matters most is the love Jesus has shown to us and the love we're called to share with each other. His example of foot washing is an example of what humility looks like. In a first century home in this region, it was not something a host would do to wash the guest's feet. In a first century home, either a servant washed the guest's feet or the guests washed their own feet. It was off-putting, as we picked up in the reading, for the disciples to experience Jesus doing this. And because of how unusual it was, it reinforces the value of service and highlights the kind of relationships they were supposed to build among themselves and in the community. It remains that visual lesson for all of us who call ourselves disciples. Jesus said, "For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them." Jesus points out that leaders are called to serve, not be served. But this also points to a different kind of social hierarchy. There is no greater status for leaders in relation to servants. Roles may vary, but both are fundamentally equal before God. This remains a challenge to any who would create or support relationships and communities in which a leader is given unquestioned authority. Jesus follows this with a related lesson. "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. For by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." This word for love in Greek is agape. It's selfless, unconditional love that seeks the well-being of others without expecting anything in return. It's what Jesus did in washing his disciples' feet, even the feet of Judas. Right after this, they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane where he prays. He asks his closest disciples to support him, to love and show care for him during his most difficult time, and they don't do it. They're too weighed down themselves. It's a disappointment to Jesus, but we know in the end that he extends grace to them. We have company when, despite our own best intentions, we miss the mark. We don't follow through on that commandment that we know so well, to love God with our whole heart, to love others as ourselves. We can see ourselves sometimes in the crowd on Palm Sunday that dissipates after the hopes and dreams they held seem to dwindle as the week goes on. We may see ourselves in the disciples who fall asleep and ultimately scatter when their faith is truly tested as Jesus is arrested. There is some bitterness in that. And yet, that's part of the beauty of that final lesson Jesus shares and the culmination of the next few days. We're called to live as Jesus did. And although we may fall asleep and fail to live up to our calling at times, Jesus invites us again and again to follow when we awake. He calls us to awake with courage and confidence, to put the past behind and look ahead. Jesus knelt as a servant to share life and hope with you. Now we are called to serve selflessly and courageously. Holy Week is the story of the passion of Jesus. His love for us led him to show us the way to live, to love those cast aside and to speak truth, even when it challenged those in power. He did this because of his love for us, even when it meant being led to the cross. On this night, remember his love. Remember the meal he left for us, his call to serve and to see our neighbors as deserving equal dignity. Above all, may you rest in his undying love and commitment to you. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.